So the simplest architecture that one may choose to use when building a application is a one-layer architecture. Now, it can be argued that a one-layer architecture is actually just the lack of an architecture, but for a moment, let's just consider this. So in the following post, I'm going to discuss a one-layer architecture and why someone may choose to use it. When building an application, we can choose to use 1, 2, 3, or multiple layers for our application architecture. A one-layer architecture includes presentation logic, business logic, and data access logic in one layer. Let's take a look at this from an API standpoint. Most APIs contain one or many controllers, so we'll describe the one-layer architecture using a controller called the person controller. This person controller will return a response containing first name, last name, and full name. This will require the presentation or formatting of a response. It will also contain the business logic, which constructs the full name property from the first name and last name, and it will retrieve the person from the database. Let's break down these three pieces of logic and show them in our controller. For our code examples, we're going to use C# and we're going to start off with an empty controller, which is where we're going to add our logic. Now, we're going to omit the data connection logic and create some code that can directly get our data from the database. We will do this by executing a stored procedure. Let's call that dbo.getPerson and pass in the ID of a person as a parameter. This call retrieves a person from the database and populates a person object of type person. We now have a person object which contains first name and last name. Our next step is to apply our business logic and create the full name property. This full name will be the first name and then the last name, but with a space in between. So let's write that code now. Now that we have our person object and the full name of that person, we can return that data from the controller. Now that we have our person object and the full name of that person, we can return that data from the controller. We now have a complete controller which returns the person which we had requested. This is pretty simple and straightforward. We're getting our person from the database. We're applying business logic to construct the full name, and we're formatting the person object to return all three properties. Some of the pros for this approach is that most of the logic, and in this case all of the logic, is found in a single class and potentially a single method, which is relatively simple. The logic required to get the data, apply the business logic, and format the data is found sequentially in one method. Currently, this is very easy to read, and another developer need not look much further to understand what's going on to return this data. Now for the cons. Well, first of all, we're not really following any common design patterns and principles, and the first one that comes to mind is the single responsibility principle. Our controller is obviously doing many things, primarily the three things that I've listed, which is getting data, applying business logic, and then formatting a response for the API. Another con is that the code will probably become difficult to maintain as complexity increases. This example has an absolute minimum amount of business logic, and chances are realistic examples will have much more logic. So you can see that as more code gets added to this, as more changes occur, this is going to get much more complicated. Another big con is that we cannot truly write a unit test. And I mean this as a unit test from the strict standpoint, where a unit test should test one unit of work, and a unit test definitely should not hit the database. So what's the conclusion? Well, a one-layer architecture can have its place in POCs and small personal projects. As you can see, this architecture quickly becomes inadequate as code and business logic increases. It's highly recommended that any application in a professional atmosphere leverages an architecture with more than just one layer. The question is, how should this look? How many layers should we use? Well, I'm going to save that one for the next post where I dive into a two-layer architecture.